Dim the lights in your room if you like, or simply let the distant hum of a fan become a steady companion. Close your eyes for a breath and imagine the air of a valley so small that maps simply fold over it. The kind of place where stone and soil remember footfalls more faithfully than ink. This is a tale not of crowns and banners, but of hands that learn to make the earth keep its promises for another year. The place I will take you to does not need a name to be known by the people who live there, and if you listen closely, you will begin to know it as they do. You might be born here or have chosen to stay. There are no polished horses, no banners on poles, only boots clotted with mud and faces that recall rain. If you like histories that move slowly, like a flock across a pasture, stay with this story. If it comforts you to breathe with it, subscribe and return when you need this rhythm. For now, breathe out and feel the damp straw scent rising, the quick edge of smoke, the sweet sour of leaven. You are at the edge of the map and within the boundary of a single day. We will walk its lanes, taste its pottage, count its losses, and watch how people defy death in small, steady acts. Ahead of you, the valley narrows between hedgerows and thickets. The fields are stitched into strips that keep to memory rather than plan, each held by a family who knows the soil by the voice it makes when the spade bites in a dry year. The path from the common green curves past a low chapel with a mossed roof and a bell that cannot be heard from very far. The steward does not pass through these lanes often. The reeve does. The reeve, as older tongues say, is a name for a man who counts what is owed and adjusts the burdens in whispered meetings. You learn the lay of such a place by grading stones with your foot and by the order of shutters on windows. The landscape is not dramatic, it is patient. A brook that smells like iron and wet clay runs past the village and carries away husks and secrets with equal haste. Beyond, low hills hold sheep like pale stones. In the afternoons, the air tastes faintly of hay and of the sharp tang from the tannery on the west slope. Names matter little to the wider world. They matter here because the name of a field marks where a child learned to pull carrots and where an old woman buried a husband. You will meet people who perform tasks that the Lord never saw, and who keep each other from vanishing into penury by gestures that read like prayers. Inside the houses, the material world presses close. Walls made of wattle and daub still carry the damp of winter within their clay ribs. Thatch smells of dried grass and smoke. The floors are beaten earth, and the hearth is the center and the calendar both. Pots hang from hooks darkened by soot, and you learn the time by the way the coals lie. A table is a plank, scarred by knives, and patched more than once. Bedding is piled on benches and on the floor when needed, wrapped in wool that has seen many winters and mended seams. Chickens roost in the eaves, and sometimes the small pig sleeps under the table. The pottage is kept thick so that a single spoonful can sustain 2 children. Names appear in the household like stitches. Mother Ellen is the one who knows every scrap of recipe that keeps infants breathing through coughs. Thomas the miller runs the water wheel each other day with an oath and a muttered prayer. Miriam, who tends the dye vats, keeps the children from the river when fever rides heavy in the air. Jory, the youngest son of a field family, learns the contour of the plow the way others learn letters. Brother Aldrich rings the small chapel bell and keeps the parish records. And Steward Baldwin arrives sometimes with a pouch and a ledger and a voice that makes people count twice. Old Wayne, who walks with a bent staff, tells stories of times when harvests were fuller and when the Lord would send bread to the poor. These names are not heroic. They are specific, and they matter because each carries a task that keeps the rest breathing. You are taught to feel the house as a living thing. The thatch creaks in rain with a sound like distant footsteps. Touch the plaster, and you will find small remnants of straw pressed into it, like fossils of industry. The mattress feels sprung in the middle because it has been passed down and patched. It smells faintly of lavender because someone thought to keep moths at bay. At night, the animals shift and make soft sounds that the nervous call the village chorus. The hearth is loud in its silence, a small furnace that remembers every time someone burned bread and learned to coax the coals back. You learn the household rules by an economy of gestures. A nod across the table can transfer food.
A wrapped parcel of salt or a saved onion says love and strategy at once. Children learn to quarter bread, not out of charity, but because the rhythm of scarcity is taught early. You feel close to people by the way they keep their spoons clean and by the way they cough into sleeves late at night. The day begins when the first man pulls the latch of the yard gate and the dog answers with a warning bark. Work is measured by the sky and season rather than by hours. Spring is fear and hope tangled together. Sowing is a ceremony where seeds are measured into palms. And
a cross is drawn when the soul seeks blessing. The harvest is gratitude disguised as labor, tenfold sweat for a handful of grain that must be thrashed and winnowed and stored for months. The tasks are endless, and the language the people use to speak of them is full of verbs for enduring. They mend, they stitch, they dig, they stack, they argue with rain. Fields must be turned before frost, fences repaired before lambing, ale brewed in sufficient quantity to keep the household warmed and convivial. Day work is done in rotation, with neighbors helping neighbors during plowing or harvest, and in return the same favor will be called upon come lean winter. There are small dialogues throughout the morning, not polished conversations, but exchanges that move the work. At the mill, Tomas speaks with the miller boy about the warp of grain, and Brother Aldrich stops by to collect a small bag for the church. These exchanges are deliberate, and many are long enough to teach the world how people rely on speech as much as muscle. A conversation on a bright morning on the green takes shape like this. You overhear, and then you are a part of it, because that is how stories travel. Jory says, "I have seen the furrow deeper this year." Miriam answers, "The rain gave it to us for a night only." Jory says, "We will need more seed." Miriam says, "Where will you take the money to buy it?" Jory says, "We will trade the pig and borrow from old wine." Miriam asks, "And then what, if the pig dies?" Jory says, "Then we go." Old wine mutters, "You always say that until you have to walk past the reeve." Jory says, "The reeve can count me into the ditch if he likes." Old wine says, "He cannot bury all our stubbornness." Brother Aldrich smiles and says, "Stubbornness keeps the bell ringing." Thomas says, "You will need my wagon, and I will need my apprentice." Miriam asks, "Who tends the dye vats while you are gone?" Thomas says, "Miriam, you worry as if the harvest were your child." This string of speech stretches out 10 or 12 small admits and answers, each carrying practical detail and affection. It is the sort of conversation that keeps calendars aligned and grudges light. It shows how a community plans around the fragile goods they own and the constant possibility of having less. The kitchen is where survival gets organized. There you will find pottage, the great thick soup that stands between people and empty bellies. It is an economy of season and of knowledge. Roots are parboiled and then mashed into the broth. Bones are soaked overnight, then simmered until the marrow and the smell take hold of the house. Herbs from the garden are kept in a jar and used with sparing hands. Salt is the most precious commodity for preservation. Smoke cures meat when the winter promises to be long. Ale keeps because it is a source of calories and a liquid that does not sour fast. Bread is a daily ritual, and the oven is a communal resource most days, with the Lord sometimes granting a right to bake and sometimes taking the tithe of grain itself. There are rules about who eats first and who takes the smallest bowl when the bread is thin. Women and men exchange instructions about stovetop timing and measure out small portions like prayers. The taste of pottage is a constellation of wet earth and roasted bone, of an herb that reminds you where you are from. Technical explanation of baking bread can be brief and precise. First, the grain must be ground at the mill until flour is fine but not overworked. Then, water is mixed with a bit of ale or sourdough starter and kneaded until the dough is elastic. After a rest to let fermentation begin, the loaf is shaped and left near the warm hearth to rise. Finally, it is slapped into a hot oven and kept until the crust sings a dull song when tapped. Each stage demands attention because fire and time cannot be hurried. Brewing ale is another craft that sustains.
Grains are mashed in hot water to release sugars, then boiled with herbs and left to cool before yeast is introduced. The vessel is sealed as much as possible and then watched over during fermentation. Ale is strained and stored in barrels that are tarred and kept cool. A successful batch is a household victory, and a failed one is a burden that can last months. Wound dressing follows old rules and sharp hands. Clean cloth, boiled water, and a salve of rendered fat and herb reduce pain and infection. Incisions are not always stitched. Sometimes they are bound and left to a pace the body will dictate. The healer marks a wound and decides which remedies are safe to offer without a barber surgeon. At around 1/3 of this journey, if you are still here, you probably feel both tender and a little heavy. If you have walked this far, you likely have a soft curiosity and some sorrow for what you have heard. Tell me where you are listening from and which smell in this story held your attention: the smoke, wet earth, or baking bread. Your reply will be read like a small ledger entry, and it will help others who come to these quiet stories feel less alone. Sharing your location is not required, but it helps build the small community that gathers here to remember lives that rarely make grand histories. Each comment makes this space more like the bench by the hearth, where people trade small truths. Thank you for staying this long. Now let us continue into the days when work and law meet and ask for payment. The steward arrives like a shadow with a ledger. Steward Baldwin wears plain colors, but carries an authority made of ink and seal. He speaks of tithes and of the Lord whom the village rarely sees. The obligation is measured not only in grain, but in labor. Corvée work is demanded for the manor, days when the plow is turned for the Lord and not for the family. People accept because they must, but there is bargaining and there are sly subversions. A woman will say, "My back has been sore since lambing," and the reeve will mark her with a cross, but that cross can sometimes be turned into a favor later. Taxes come as tithe in the autumn when grain is counted, and a tenth is offered to the church and to obligations. The reeve will tally with a practiced hand, and the steward will demand payments that force families to choose between seed and bread. You will see small scenes where someone hides a sack and another covers for them, and these small deceptions are often described with an intimacy that borders on reverence. They are strategies to keep the hearth warm and the children fed. A tense moment unfolds one afternoon when the steward calls for a reckoning. He stands in front of the green with his ledger open, and the villagers gather because they must. Steward Baldwin says, "You owe the tithe for the last harvest." Father Martin says, "We have already given what we could." Baldwin says, "Your parish owes more than what was left." Jory says, "I have a newborn to feed." Baldwin says, "That will not stop the ledger." Old Wayne says, "Perhaps a day of corvée can be traded for seeds." Baldwin says, "The Lord decides the rules." Brother Aldrich says, "The parish will help where we may." Baldwin says, "The parish is thin, and the less you can pay, the more the ledger grows." This exchange draws attention because it reveals the exact line where survival meets command. It shows the way law touches flesh and how communities respond with a mixture of argument and quiet trading. Illness waits like the damp under thatch, unseen but expected. Disease enters in patterns: a cough, a fever, a pale cheek. The village has names for the common things and few remedies that really change the course of a severe sickness. They pray, they poultice, they apply cold and heat by turns, and they remove what is rotten when necessary. There are folk cures that combine herbs and simple incantations, and there are the reserved rites of the chapel when hope runs thin. Sometimes a healer, often a woman, will boil roots and wrap cloths, muttering words that are more cadence than cure. Sometimes the fever yields to care, sometimes it does not. And sometimes what begins as a cough becomes a plague that will sweep larger regions and return the ledger to a different order. The first real moment of tension comes when a fever begins to spread among the children of one family. It is sudden enough to pull neighbors into action, and slow enough to let fear grow. In the first paragraph, you see the sequence of quick decisions and the slow spread of dread.
A mother shuts her door and burns herbs at the threshold. A neighbor dares to bring clean water and leaves coins in a bowl without speaking. The priest walks the field at a distance and says prayers that the sick cannot hear. All of these gestures exist in the narrow space between frantic hope and practical measures. People barter for remedies, and some deny the seriousness until the cough deepens. It is a moment when the social fabric is tested, and when quiet heroism becomes visible in small acts of risk and service. The second tense moment is when a market day brings a rumor of a trader with a strange cough passing through the next town. The rumor arrives like a gust of wind and then expands. Traders can be the vector of fortune and of disaster. The reeve checks gates and asks questions. Someone recalls a man who slept by the common well and coughed into his sleeve. The worry becomes organized, and the Lord sends no letters. The villagers argue about whether to warn others and how much movement to restrict without provoking officials. At its core, this crisis shows how mobility, essential for trade, creates networks that disease exploits. The debate splits neighbors into those who would shut the lanes and those who see starvation as an equal threat. A third tense moment arrives when food runs low because rain failed at the wrong time. The granary is counted with careful fingers. Children weigh the last crust under a candle and deliberate. The steward requests the tithe, and people balk because giving away a tenth when you have little is like giving away the last rope. A woman will hide a sack of grain in a peat bog because the peat is soft and the smell will mask the stash. She will not tell even her husband at first. This is a person who surreptitiously defies orders to save her child. You see in this moment how law and love collide, and why quiet acts of theft are often a form of life preservation. It is also the point where some choose to leave for the market town, while others decide to stay and press their stubbornness into the soil. A fourth moment of tension is the arrival of plague, a slow dread that eats certainty. The bell tolls more than usual, and Brother Aldrich marks names in the parish register with an unwilling hand. The sick lose strength by midday. The air begins to smell different, not merely damp, but sweetly rotten near the houses of the dying. People invent quarantines with garments and marks, and yet fear drives neighbors away at the moment when closeness is needed most. The moral calculus of care becomes a battlefield. You learn who will step forward to tend the dying and who will run too.
The hills. Those who stay are remembered, and those who leave are kept in a different ledger by gossip and silence. All these moments together make the long arc where the community must decide what it values and what it will sacrifice. Dialogue in the fever months becomes longer, harder, and more frequent. Miriam pleads, "We cannot see him like this alone." Ellen says, "What can I bring that will help?" Miriam says, "Boil the roots I told you of and wrap him in clean linen." Ellen asks, "Who will tend the other children?" Miriam answers, "Tomas has offered to take them to the mill on alternate days." Ellen says, "Tomas cannot spare the hands." Tomas says, "I will find the hands because I have daughters who can trade time for a loaf." Brother Aldrich says, "The chapel can spare a few blankets if you can fetch them." Ellen asks, "Who will fetch them?" Brother Aldrich says, "I will," and then he hesitates, and then he adds, "If I may be allowed to." This series of exchanges shows layers of negotiation and trust. There are 10 or 12 such turns in the day, and the rhythm of conversation becomes a scaffolding for action. Throughout the crisis, certain technical practices return again and again because they had been learned slowly and carefully over generations. Preservation techniques matter. Smoking meat requires a pit, a slow fire of green wood that fills a chamber with a thick aromatic that seals meat away from flies. Salting fish demands a mound of coarse salt and a press. Cabbage is left to ferment in crocks because the sharpness of lactic acid preserves the vegetable and provides vitamins. Each of these methods is not romantic, but essential, and each description could be exacting in its execution. As winter moves in, nights lengthen and rituals follow. People sleep in shifts, sometimes in a household, so that someone is always watching the fire. Dreams are spoken of as if they were instructions. A child might say, "I dreamed of the river running black," and a woman will nod and move in the morning to check the barrels. Priests hold vigils when the tolling bell is heavy, and catechism is a map for suffering that will happen anyway. The church offers routines that are as much about social order as about salvation. Mass marks the week, and confession holds an emotional ledger that lessens grief by distributing it. It is not that people do not fear death here. Rather, they situate it among neighbors and rituals. Family life becomes a test of endurance and inventiveness. Fathers teach sons to read the weather by the curl of the thatch. Mothers teach daughters to sew into the edges of cloth to make it last another season. Children learn patience as a virtue because patience is a practical currency. Small acts of subversion occur often and are described here as survival. A woman will slip grain into her apron and turn to the right field as if to spread compost. A young man will sneak into the lordly woods and drag away a fallen branch to keep the fire alive at home. These are not acts of rebellion as violent as banners and swords. They are more like quiet ethics, a way of keeping kin alive in a system that can be indifferent. The climax of the narrative arrives when the village faces a winter that threatens to break the cycle. Supplies are thin because the summer failed and the winter is earlier than remembered. The steward demands tithes, and the pledge is the last straw. In this scene, people must choose whether to risk arrest by hiding grain or to comply and face hunger. The moral urgency is sharp and the outcome uncertain. A small council forms near the chapel porch and choices are argued in whispers. Some insist we must give the tithe in the hope it will stop worse reprisals. Others insist we must feed our children first. The decision is not heroic in the popular sense. It is a calculus of love and fear. Then comes the slow turn toward resilience. People organize shared meals and rotate watch at the granary. A woman who had been secretive about a cache brings a cup and offers it at the door, and the gesture spreads. The Lord does not send soldiers. The steward's ledger is heavy, and the man who carries it grows tired and, for a moment, human. When the famine loosens its grip, it is because of those small rules of sharing and because a trader passing through, who had been turned away for days, returns with a sack and, for a price that is high but fair, buys enough grain to give several families a breath. The rest is slow. You will notice the way's recovery is uneven and how certain names fade under the weight of death while others become anchors. The epilogue follows time in small, precise moments. 1 month later, the village breathes differently. Wounds are dressed and some cough, but the immediate danger has receded. The granary has been counted and the ledger adjusted through gifts and small thefts that were forgiven or ignored. People are quieter now, their speech full of gratitude and of a new thin caution. A small memorial is put up in the chapel for those who died, and the priest reads names slowly, imprinting loss into parish memory. The harvest plans are altered, and seed is saved with extra care. 1 month thus marks a rawness and beginning. 3 months on, the thaw is in the air, and work resumes more fully. Children return to a rough routine, and the mill runs. Those who left to find work in towns return with new stories and with longer faces. The steward is less visible. Bargains have been made, and an understanding settles into the way the reeve looks at people. Some families are smaller,
but steadier, and the shared meals have formed a habit that will outlast immediate hunger. The season brings new tasks and a sense of cautious hope. People plant with a watchfulness born of the recent past, and they talk of storing differently, of making stronger nets of barter and mutual aid. 6 months after the crisis, the valley has changed in subtle but lasting ways. New habits are in place. Children born in the months after carry a fragility in their small bodies that causes an entire family to alter routines. The chapel holds a vigil that is no longer urgent but commemorative, and Brother Aldrich has begun to write a small account that will be referred to in future seasons. Some names remain in the ledger of the living, and some have moved into a different ledger altogether. A few quiet rebellions, like the decision to hide seed or to trade services rather than coin, become normalized as survival strategies. The village understands itself more as an organism than as a list of households. It has learned to treat strangers with suspicion and neighbors with structured generosity. This is not triumph in a grand sense. It is, instead, an accumulated wisdom that will propagate to the next harvest and the next child. Before we close, a final reflection may be useful. The endurance you have been observing does not require monuments. It requires hands that remember how to mend, how to feed, how to confess, how to share, and how to bury. The people in this valley defied death not by defeating it, but by making sure that the lines of life were continuous. Small acts of care, of secret caches, of shared hours at the mill became a kind of stubborn religion. If this narrative softened a corner of your thought, if it made you think differently about the ways ordinary people keep the world in motion, consider returning here. If you want more stories of the unnoticed lives that sustain history, subscribe and bring someone who might listen. They did not have monuments, they had hands that taught the soil to remember them.